Hey there, fellow soldiers. Isn't it based in red pill to get shot in the face for our president? Better yet, to protect Ukraine, my home country, a nation of babushkas after my own heart. People you've never met have the power to decide the ultimate fate of your country. And if you don't play along, you're the isolationist to blame if the innocents they put at risk happen to die. Nothing quite like being gaslit by rulers who expect you to see their warmongering as benevolence. Unlike gun nuts who only ever have spurious and impulsive motives for their interests in armed conflict, heads of state would never enter a war for any other reason than their moral convictions. Don't worry about how the fog of war and debt can benefit the instigators behind the scenes. Look at how stylish the service rifle is. We'll deal with the insurmountable amounts of debt later. It's not like we're already hyperinflated and just suspended the economy for 3 years over an illness that somehow struggles to kill 90-year-olds even more than I do. We can totally afford to alienate half the world economy over Soviet leftovers. Non-essential businesses like saloons were suspended during World War I, and we just dealt with the strain on the economy. Other than the Great Depression, Hitler rising to power, and every single mob in America coming into existence, there were really no downsides to supporting the war effort. Plus, I bet the soldiers felt real patriotic dying for their country. The politicians would come down here themselves to fight, but they have more important things to do, like running non-profits to build back better. Speaking of building back better, I didn't know it meant from smoldering radioactive rubble. The only BBB I want to hear about is Bussy, Bunghole, and Baba Ganoush. In 2016, Trump said interventionism would lead to World War III with Russia and receive bipartisan ridicule. Same thing happened in 2012 and 08 when Ron Paul suggested the insane idea of not having soldiers in other countries for no reason. It seems the easiest way to get publicly humiliated by all sides is to be anti-interventionist and anti-war. I wonder why. Well, from 1992 to 2008, the US invaded and maintained a military presence in the Middle East and the Balkans under Bill Clinton and George Bush. It was during this time period that DynCorp, a private military contractor, was found to be running child sex trafficking operations in Bosnia, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Speaking of Bush, he also founded the No Child Left Behind program, also known as No Child's Behind Left Intact. His grandfather, Prescott Bush, Republican senator and banker, also did a little trolling by partnering up with Avril Harriman, Democrat Secretary of Commerce and fellow bonesman, to help finance Hitler. Another avid collaborator of the Third Reich was a certain Eugene Wilhelm Schwab, who worked at Escher Weiss, supplying Nazis with flamethrowers and turbines made by way of forced labor. He isn't to be confused with the father of Klaus Schwab, who had the exact same name, was married to a woman of the same name, and just so happened to work at the same engineering company as Klaus. If you don't know who Klaus Schwab is, I envy you. He's the head of the World Economic Forum, architect of the Great Reset, and founder of the Young Global Leaders Initiative, alumni of which include Putin, Macron, Zuckerberg, and Pete Buttigieg of all people. Another name for the Great Reset is the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which Putin pledged allegiance to in his speeches at Davos. Mr. Schwab explicitly said that reinventing capitalism after COVID is the way to build back better. Wait a minute, where have I heard that before? The point is that warmongering from people in power isn't a bug, it's a feature of their default configuration. If the real objective was just annexing Ukraine, why didn't Putin do it when Trump was president? When the risk of escalation was minimal. He only does it after Biden is in office, whose son's favorite crack pad is in Ukraine. Almost like he waited until it would cause the maximum amount of drawn-out chaos, as opposed to a swift power grab. I'm left wondering who could benefit from that. Banks. The more the government borrows money from the central bank at interest, the more they get paid. So the whole business of a central bank is creating debt. With the extent of the control they have over the economy, it's relatively easy to incentivize borrowing. Artificially driving down interest rates makes debt cheap, and people jump on it because they think it's free money, rather than a loan that will be paid back via inflation. At some point, people are reluctant to borrow anymore, but since bankers are size queens, it's necessary to maintain the illusion that GDP is growing and the economy isn't a huge pyramid scheme. This is where the government comes in handy, because social welfare, open-ended space programs, and, you guessed it, wars, help to expand that pile. The conflict in itself and the efforts to rebuild after the fact will ensure the country's indebtedness for the next century. As a bonus, whoever owns that debt is the one in control. During the Nuremberg trials, the Nazi Party admitted that if it hadn't been for the Swiss banks, they wouldn't have been able to fight for as long as they did. When the bankers settle amongst themselves when the war should end and which side should win, they just demand repayment from or stop lending to the other side. This is why the Rothschilds had a penchant for funding both sides of every war, because the collateral they collect is the control of a nation. This is why Nixon and FDR made it their mission to detach the dollar from the gold standard, so that the government could inflate it freely. Does it surprise you that the man who idealized the Federal Reserve, Republican Senator Nelson Aldrich, was close friends with JP Morgan? That his daughter married J.D. Rockefeller Jr., whose dad contributed to the Third Reich? Confused yet? I sure am. Trying to digest the whole of it is a bigger log than any of us can swallow, but I can give you a few examples to illustrate how far back it goes. 70% of the first bank of the United States was owned by foreigners, primarily Britain, whose banks were dominated by the Rothschilds. Mere months after the bank's charter was allowed to expire, certainly displeasing its shareholders, the War of 1812 was instigated with the then almost exclusively Rothschild-financed Britain, by Nathan Mayer Rothschild specifically. Coincidentally, the war drove the US so deep into debt that they just had to charter a second bank in the United States as a lender of last resort, 60% of its shares being owned by European investors, particularly Nathan's brother, James Rothschild of France. You know, the same France that was just warring with England? When Andrew Jackson didn't renew the charter, an assassination attempt ensued. The would-be assassin said he was a deposed British king who wanted to kill Jackson to improve the economy. I wonder what he meant by that. That free banking period ended when the Civil War began, followed by Lincoln's enactment of the National Bank Act, along with the first income tax. The bank was John Sherman's idea, who, in his correspondence with the Rothschild brothers, said, "The great body of the people will bear the system's burdens without complaint, and perhaps without even suspecting the system is inimical to their interests." Due to Lincoln refusing to take high-interest debt from Europeans and his successful efforts to keep foreign investors out, he got rewarded with a bullet in the head. Meanwhile, Southern secession was financed by Emil Erlanger, a German Jewish financier who worked as a dispatcher for the Rothschilds. His loan of $15 million was backed by cotton and would only be profitable if the South won. Lucky for him, he sold the debt to speculators at a profit before the end of the war. Debt used to be inherited by individuals until someone paid it off or took it to their grave, so people were driven to avoid it because, well, they had the option to. With debt being nationalized through the currency, however, countries with a budget surplus are virtually unheard of, and the debt is distributed as if the average person were on the hook for $500,000. It's harder to handle $200 trillion of debt as an individual instead of a collection of bureaucrats. If I owed that much, all I'd be able to say to the debt collector is, Metro boom and make it boom. I'd be like, yo, debt collector, check this out, bro. Oh my gosh, Ronnie,